The easiest way to break a black athlete is not to bench him. It is to make him question his own pain. Tell him he's soft. Tell him he's scared. Tell him everybody's banged up this time of year. Tell him greatness requires playing through discomfort. Tell him the body is lying and the coach knows better. Then wait. If he goes back out there and gets hurt worse, call it bad luck. If he refuses, call it attitude. Either way, the truth gets buried under toughness. Jalen Brooks had heard all of it before. So when Coach Travis Hall smirked in front of half the locker room and said, "You ain't injured, son. You're just not built for pressure," Jalen didn't answer right away. He just looked down at the knee brace in his hands and thought, "Tomorrow, the machine is going to tell the truth you refuse to hear from me." Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, exposure, and moments when the proof hits too hard to laugh off, subscribe and stay with me. Westlake University football lived on ritual, money, and denial. The stadium held 65,000. The boosters held everybody else. And the program held itself together the way a lot of winning institutions do, with tradition up front, fear in the walls, and just enough success to make people excuse what they would call abusive anywhere else. Jalen Brooks was the starting cornerback. 21. Fast enough to make quarterbacks regret eye contact. Smart enough to read route trees before the snap settled. Disciplined enough to study film like a graduate student and tackle like he had a private argument with gravity. He was not the loudest player on the roster. Not the most hyped. Not the one with the biggest nil deal. But if you asked the defensive staff, honestly, privately, without a microphone in the room, they would have told you that Jalen was the one who held the secondary together. At least, that was what they said before conference championship week made honesty expensive. The injury happened in practice on a Tuesday. Nothing cinematic. That was part of the problem. A hard plan on the left leg during one-on-one coverage, receiver selling outside before breaking in, Jalen shifting to mirror, then a sharp slip in the turf and a hot tearing pain under the kneecap with something deeper behind it that made his stomach turn before he hit the ground. Not a full collapse. Not screaming. No crowd gasp. No ambulance. Just that terrible athlete's knowledge, something moved wrong. He got up because that's what athletes do first. Then tried to jog it out. Then realized immediately the leg did not trust him anymore. Trainer Jenna Morales saw it from 10 yards away and jogged over. "You good?" Jalen shook his head. "No." "Where?" He pointed. "Front and inside." Not a clean answer because knee injuries are traitors like that. They speak in overlap. Jenna had him off to the sideline within a minute. Range of motion limited. Pain with rotation. Swelling beginning. Stability questionable. Not enough for a screaming diagnosis. More than enough to stop. She told him she wanted imaging. He nodded. That should have been the end of that afternoon. It wasn't. Coach Travis Hall came over near the end of practice with the defensive coordinator and the particular expression certain white coaches wear when a black athlete's injury appears at the exact wrong moment for the season they believe belongs to them. Hall was 50, broad, red-faced from a life of yelling indoors and outdoors with equal conviction, beloved by alumni, feared by equipment staff, and protected by the kind of winning record that lets cruelty pass as culture. He did not think of himself as racist. Men like him almost never do. They think they are old school. Demanding. Honest. Competitive. What they really are is accustomed to black bodies being available to their ambition. He stopped in front of the training table where Jalen sat with his leg elevated. "What's the verdict?" Jenna answered before Jalen could. "Needs imaging. Swelling's building and I don't like the instability." Hall looked at Jalen. "You feel unstable or you hurt?" Jalen said, "Both." Hall gave a short laugh. "Funny how everything hurts in championship week." Jenna's face changed slightly. She had worked sports medicine long enough to know when coaching language stopped being motivational and became dangerous. "I'm serious," she said. "He needs evaluation." Hall didn't look at her. He looked at Jalen. "You know what I think?" he said. "I think you tweaked it, got scared, and now everybody's acting like we need to wrap you in bubble wrap." The defensive coordinator, white, silent, complicit, said nothing. Jalen felt the heat rise under his skin, not because he was unsure, but because men like Hall had turned certainty into a trap. If he insisted, he was soft. If he stayed quiet, they decided for him. If he played and got worse, he paid for it in his body while they paid for it in cliches. I know what I felt, Jalen said. Hall smiled. That little mean smile coaches use when they think the room is on their side. That's the problem with your generation, he said. Everybody feels too much. A couple players nearby went carefully still. Not because they agreed. Because they recognized the scene. Jalen looked down at his knee. He had grown up in Houston. He knew pressure. He knew football pain. He knew soreness, bruising, dead legs, rolled ankles, jammed fingers, hip pointers, and all the 1,000 bargains the game asks young men to make with their own bodies. This wasn't that. He said, "It's not soreness." Hall folded his arms. "You ain't injured, son. You're just not built for pressure." The locker room got quieter, even at a distance. That line was not for diagnosis. It was for ownership. It told every player in earshot what the system would now demand of Jalen. Pain would only count if someone more powerful found it convenient. Jenna stepped in. "Coach, he's out until imaging." Hall finally looked at her then, and for 1 second Jalen was grateful she existed in the room because otherwise the whole thing would have turned into a public test of his manhood instead of the medical issue it was. Hall said, "Tomorrow morning." "Fine. But I expect him in meetings." Then he walked off like he had already solved the problem. That night, the story spread through the team exactly the way such stories always do. Brooks might be ducking. Coach says he's tight, not torn. Championship week got in his head. Maybe they're resting him. Maybe he's done. Every version cost him something. Teammates texted. His mother called. A cousin posted, praying for two, before even knowing what prayer was for. Jalen lay awake in the athletic dorm with his leg throbbing and thought about all the ways black athletes are taught to distrust their own bodies if white authority wants performance badly enough. Pain becomes weakness. Self-protection becomes fear. Medical caution becomes disloyalty. By morning, he was angrier than scared. That helped. The MRI was scheduled for 8:30 a.m. at the University Sports Medicine Center. Jenna met him there. No team staff. No coaches. Just a sports physician, the tech, and the clean and different authority of a machine that did not care about culture, legacy, toughness, or conference standings. That was one of the reasons Jalen loved imaging. Not the waiting. Not the claustrophobic noise. The fairness. The machine does not care who starts. It does not care who sells tickets. It does not care who the coach yelled at yesterday. It just shows what's there. The scan took 25 minutes. Then 40 more for review because the physician wanted ortho to look too. Jalen sat on the edge of the exam chair with the paper drape crackling under his hands while Jenna leaned against the counter reading his face the way good trainers do, letting you keep your dignity while still staying close enough if it breaks. Finally Dr. Rachel Kim came in with the images loaded on the tablet. White coat. Measured expression. No drama. That worried him more than panic would have. She turned the screen toward him. "I'm glad you didn't practice yesterday." Jalen said nothing. Just looked. She pointed. Partial thickness tear. Medial patellar retinaculum. Bone bruising. Significant soft tissue strain. Not career-ending. Bad enough. Bad enough that if he had practiced through it hard, especially with contact, he could have turned a recoverable injury into surgery. Jalen stared at the image. There it was. Black and white and merciless. Not pressure. Not nerves. Not softness. Not fear. A tear. Jenna exhaled like she had been holding a private argument with the universe since Tuesday and had finally won on paper. Dr. Kim said, "You're out this week. Probably more than this week." Jalen nodded once. Not because he was okay. Because the machine had spoken and there was a strange relief in finally being allowed to trust what his own body had been saying from the start. The Sports Medicine Center sent the report to football operations at 10:02 a.m. By 10:14, Coach Hall wanted him in the facility. Of course he did. The defensive meeting room felt different when Jalen walked in on crutches. Not because players hadn't seen hurt men before. Because they had all heard what Hall said yesterday. And now they could see the brace. The imaging envelope. Jenna walking beside him with the flat face of a professional who had run out of patience. The room held linebackers, corners, grad assistants, the coordinator, and Hall at the front near the projector. He looked at Jalen. Then at Jenna. Then at the envelope. Something in his posture changed. Not conscience. Calculation. What did they say? Jalen did not answer. Jenna did. He has a tear. The word moved through the room like an electrical event. Not full silence. That moment before silence. The intake before people realize the joke is dead. Hall nodded once too quickly. Well, he said, good thing we checked. Jalen looked at him. That was the moment he almost lost his temper, not because Hall had been wrong, but because Hall was already trying to rewrite the timeline in real time. Good thing we checked. As if Hall had not mocked the report. As if Jalen had not been called soft in front of teammates. As if black athletes are not constantly forced to survive that exact transformation from suspicion to concern the second proof appears. Jenna saved him from having to speak first. No, she said. Good thing he stopped. That landed like a helmet dropped on concrete. Players looked from her to Hall. The coordinator stared at the projector remote in his hand like maybe if he focused hard enough on buttons this would become a film session problem instead of a moral one. Hall's face hardened. Let's not do this in front of the whole room. Jalen laughed once. No humor in it. That's interesting, he said, because yesterday worked fine for you. Nobody moved. The whole defense was now sitting in the exact kind of witness silence institutions hate. Not noisy enough to punish. Too real to control. Hall looked at the envelope in Jenna's hand. Let me see the report. Jenna slid it to him. He scanned the first page. Then the second. Then the printed MRI still. And just like that, the man who had smirked at pain 20 hours earlier went quiet. Not because he had become thoughtful. Because there are moments when the paper takes the swagger out of a room. A tear is very rude that way. One of the safeties in the back muttered, damn. Another player said, so he was right. No one corrected him. Hall placed the report on the table and tried to recover the last scraps of authority available to him. All right, he said. We'll adjust the depth chart. That was when Jalen understood something important. The machine had exposed the tear. But the room needed something else exposed too. He stepped forward once on the crutches and said, say it. Hall frowned. Excuse me? In front of everybody. Say what you said yesterday was wrong. The room went dead. Players looked up. Assistants looked down. Jenna stayed exactly where she was. Because now the question wasn't whether Jalen was injured. It was whether the coach who had mocked him in front of the team would be required to drag accountability through the same public space. Hall's face turned the hard pink of a man who had never had to apologize where his power lived. You've made your point. No, Jalen said. The MRI made my point. I'm asking you to make yours. There are moments when the truth becomes too expensive not to say out loud. This was one of them. Hall's jaw worked. Finally he said, I was wrong about the injury. Not enough. Jalen held his gaze. Hall knew it too. Everybody knew it. So he added, quieter, meaner to himself now than to the room, and I shouldn't have questioned whether you were built for pressure. There. That was it. Not beautiful. Not transformational. But true enough to stand. And once said, it changed something bigger than the depth chart. Because every player in that room now knew two things. The coach could be wrong. And a black athlete did not have to bleed further to earn permission to protect his own body. Westlake lost the championship without Jalen. By 4 points. Predictably, the alumni boards and local radio men spent a week arguing about whether he could have given them one good game through the pain if he really wanted it badly enough. People always ask that question most loudly about young black men's bodies, as if sacrifice belongs most naturally there. Jalen rehabbed in silence for a while. Then not in silence. A month later, when he was walking without the brace and the anger had settled into something more useful, he sat on a panel for student-athlete health with the sports medicine department and told the story clean. Not every insult. Enough. At some point, he said into the mic, we have to stop teaching athletes that listening to pain is weakness until a scan makes our body legible to other people. That clip spread across campus in a day. By spring semester, the athletic department announced revised injury reporting procedures. Trainers gained final authority on immediate practice removal. Coaches got mandatory athlete care training that players privately called the Jalen Rule. Hall remained employed, winning men usually do, but he was quieter around injuries after that. Much quieter. The version most people would tell was simple. A white coach mocked a black athlete's injury report. The MRI exposed the tear. The coach went silent. But the truer version was this: a black player knew his own body was in danger. A white coach heard vulnerability and translated it into weakness because the season mattered more to him than the athlete's trust in his own pain. A machine later showed exactly what the player already knew from inside the body he was being asked to betray. And once the tear appeared on that screen, the same room that had been comfortable with mockery had to sit still and watch evidence do what respect should have done the first time. That is what prejudice often looks like in sports. Not always slurs. Sometimes just a demand for performance that falls hardest on black bodies. A quicker suspicion. A harder test of manhood. A coach deciding that toughness means obedience until the scan proves the body was telling the truth all along. Until the MRI exposes the tear. And then suddenly the real weakness in the room is not the athlete who spoke up. It is the authority that laughed before it looked. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe, and stay close. There are more stories like this one waiting.